Hi, I'm Jason Stein, publisher of Automotive News. We can all agree that information is the most valuable resource in our ever-changing, ever-dynamic, and ever-resilient automotive world. Content, as the saying goes, is always king.
At Automotive News, we are deeply committed to keeping you informed. Our connected, experienced, and global team of more than 50 reporters and editors work around the clock in all mediums to deliver accurate and thorough reporting and analysis.
The result? Our team produces more than 100 original articles every week with coverage of the industry that's deep, timely, and critical to operating your business.
We cover automakers and suppliers around the world with features including exclusive executive interviews and insights into future product plans.
We cover every corner of automotive retail, including finance and insurance, mergers and acquisitions, retail technology, and dealership best practices.
And we cover what's next in transportation, whether it's autonomous cars, ride-hailing services, or alternative business models.
Plus, our Research and Data Center provides insights, data, and lists to help inform decision makers across the industry.
Short on time? We can help. Tune into our daily newscasts, First Shift and Auto News Now. We'll get you caught up on the day's top stories in a matter of minutes.
Automotive news events bring together the industry's top leaders for exclusive discussions and critical conversations that offer insights and strategies designed to help inform your business.
So that's our story, and it's a good one. Whether in print, on our website, at our events, on our videos, or in our podcasts, Automotive News is a resource you can depend on to navigate uncertain times. Thank you for the support, thank you for the trust, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
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 And thanks to you, everyone here at CAR MBS. We're in the trade session, and all of our folks online. Welcome to our first hybrid CAR MBS. I'm really happy to have you here. I was getting ready this morning back in my condo, and I have a 16-year-old son, and he says, "So what are you doing today, Mom?" I said, "I'm gonna go talk about trade." And he said, "Again?" And I said, "Yes, again, and still, but it's different." You know, I've spent the last 4 years on this trade topic pretty in depth. The new administration certainly has similar goals to the past one, more U.S. jobs as the base of all of that, but very different strategies are being employed in the trade space, and we're going to talk about that. We have a new U.S. trade representative in Catherine Tai, who's helping the president shift to something the administration is calling worker-centered trade. And we have a new USMCA that's just over a year old, and I'm sure a lot of you have been working to comply and come into compliance with that new agreement, and there's still a few little rough spots that we'll talk about. There are continuing tensions with China, and a new combative stance from Beijing with the new ambassador, Qinggang. And his words in the paper this week were he's willing to ruffle a little feathers. So I think China is staying smack dab in the middle of our trade agenda. And of course, all of you are dealing with the things that happened as a result of the pandemic. The pandemic disruptions to supply chain and global shipping. If anything has illuminated that we're a global, interconnected, and pretty fragile supply chain the auto industry is reliant on, this is it. All of this posts a whole bunch of challenges and opportunities for this industry, and we're going to talk about those with three top trade experts with us today. My panelists, we are three. I'm going to start with Brad Markell. Brad Markell is the Executive Director of the AFL-CIO Industrial Union Council and the Working for America Institute. He leads the AFL's climate and energy policy work, and he's a trade advisor to the AFL's president, Richard Trumka. He's also a member of UAW Local 14 and served as an international rep in the research department supporting bargaining and automotive policy, and was a member of the Biden-Harris Transition and Agency Review Team at the Energy Department. We'll next go to my colleague here, Ann Wilson. She's the Senior Vice President of the Motor and Equipment Manufacturers Association, or MEMA. She's the Chief Lobbyist for the motor vehicle supplier members, many of you here, and of MEMA's 4 divisions, including the OESA, the Original Equipment Suppliers Association. And finally, we'll hear a little bit from Michael Dunne. He's the CEO of ZoZo Go. That's an investment advisory firm that advises on future trends in electric and automated vehicle technologies and the change and the growing role of China. Michael went to China very early in his career. He spent many years working in the Asia-Pacific region. He has deep expertise in China and always very insightful comments about the Chinese auto market. He's assisted the Detroit 3, Mercedes, Volkswagen, and many suppliers to enter China, Thailand, Indonesia, and Vietnam. And he served for a time as president of GM Indonesia. And with that, I'm going to kick it to my friend Brad. Hi, Brad.
Morning. Thanks, Kristin, and thanks to CAR for inviting the AFL-CIO to be here. Happy to share our views about what is going on in this very exciting moment from labor's point of view on trade. In early June, the AFL-CIO had the honor of hosting Catherine Tai, the trade ambassador, at our building for a historic speech, the first time a trade ambassador came to the House of Labor to hold a town hall meeting about the Biden administration's vision for a worker-centered trade policy. Simply put, the idea is that economic policy, including trade policy, must deliver prosperity for all Americans, not just profits for corporations. It's a bold new direction for trade policy that we think can set the standard for global trade policy. For years, we've had a debate about the nature of trade policy and what it means to have a worker-friendly model. We're now starting to finally build a foundation for that. Let me be clear from the start. Workers and unions are not anti-trade, but we oppose a corporate-driven model that has dominated trade policy for 30 years. We believe it's misguided, that an approach that prioritizes profits and investor rights over workers' rights and environmental protections. It's based on the myth that simply lowering tariffs would make us all better off. Instead, jobs went by the wayside and inequality exploded. So we need a new model, a model fit for confronting the climate crisis, one that recognizes that clean energy goods made with forced labor have no place in the fight to reduce emissions, one that recognizes that worker rights must be at the center of trade agreements. For that to happen, working people have to be part of the process. We have to be consulted from the start. We have to have the seat at the table. And we know this is possible because the USMCA showed us that it's possible. Labor was involved in negotiations from day one, and we held out for a deal that would be enforceable and hold employers accountable. When the original negotiators delivered an unenforceable agreement, we mobilized our allies in Congress and made it clear, make significant changes or we will block this agreement. Unions were deeply involved in renegotiating USMCA, and unlike the original NAFTA, USMCA includes labor standards in the core text of the agreement. In the end, we created a new historic enforcement tool, the Rapid Response Mechanism, that allows the United States, Mexico, and Canada to take action against facilities that violate freedom of association and collective bargaining rights. It targets specific facilities, works fast, and delivers justice for workers. The new USMCA includes other advancements on labor rights, ensuring migrant workers are protected under labor laws, recognizing the right to strike as an inherent freedom of association, prohibiting the importation of imported goods. USMCA should be the floor on which we continue to build a new trade model. We've joined our global union allies to call for the establishment of a labor working group at the World Trade Organization. Here's the bottom line. We believe there are three core elements to any worker-centered trade policy. First, the process matters. Agreements should be negotiated through a transparent, democratic, and inclusive process. Second, our trade deals must contain clear, strong, and enforceable labor standards. That means upholding fundamental rights agreed to upon by businesses, workers, and governments at the International Labor Organization. Third, agreements must set a high bar for corporate conduct. Companies must meet globally accepted standards like the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises across their operations and their supply chains. Too often, firms with high labor standards at home do not act in accordance with those values when they do business abroad. It must stop. A new era is in our reach. That's what's exciting about this moment. An era when we fight climate change and we reduce inequality and build a more just future for all of us. We've taken the first steps towards a brighter future with the USMCA. We can build from there. We can make all the trade agreements better. Now we have to sustain that progress. We can deliver a worker-centered trade policy that builds prosperity in the United States and across the globe. Certainly workers in other countries want to benefit from trade and from economic development. They deserve to benefit from trade and economic development. And we believe we're on the path to get that done. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Brad. That was a great introduction to this topic and where we stand politically. I'm going to turn it now to Ann Wilson here in person to give the perspective of the suppliers.
Well, thank you, Kristin, and thank you, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here with all of you at MBS. It's nice to see so many familiar faces, not just on Zoom calls. So again, I look forward to seeing many of you either today or in the break or at the reception this evening. I'd like to thank Kristin and the entire CAR team for inviting me. So I'm not sure my family said the same thing that Kristin's 16-year-old said, but I think they probably were thinking it when I said, why are you going to Michigan? And I said, well, talk about global trade challenges. And I think they all sort of said, well, do you talk about anything else? Obviously, we do. And obviously, there are a lot of challenges facing the supplier industry, but global trade challenges, I think, have been additive for our community. We saw an era of, as Brad mentioned, USMCA, but also of tariffs. But we have seen additional challenges and real hurt points, pain points for the entire industry as we've moved forward within 2021. So I wanted to talk about a few of them. And I think one thing that's important to realize is suppliers are not monolithic. And I mean, I'm talking to the supplier community and you say, yeah, of course you're not, but there are some who are not suppliers here. Where we see things that are in common and where we see things that are reaching across our tier 2s and our tier 1s and even the OEMs. Supply chain and raw materials. Obviously, one of the biggest issues right now, I'll talk about that in a minute. USMCA, Brad just mentioned this, and obviously we have some of our own views on how things are progressing there. And I'd like to talk a little bit about tariffs and sort of restructure the conversation about what tariffs are actually doing for US manufacturing and US employment. I'm really looking forward to our conversation with Michael about China. I think that things are changing as we talk about China and how we're going to move forward. And then I have to kind of poke Kristin a little bit and talk about a little bit about the domestic agenda and what that means for global trade overall. So the supply chain, and I'd like to recognize my colleagues, Steve Horaney and Julie Freem from OESA on semiconductors right now. Since January, OESA and MEMA have been in constant, and I mean weekly, if sometimes not daily, conversations about what we are doing on semiconductors. This is probably the #1 supply chain crisis, but keep in mind, it's not the only crisis our members are seeing. They're seeing the increasing cost of steel and aluminum, other raw materials, resins, and a slowdown at the ports. So depending on which supplier you talk to, they're going to feel one of these pain points more significantly. On USMCA, it's going to be an interesting dialogue with Brad and myself on how we are going forward. But I would say that we probably find ourselves that we have more in common than I think one might believe. We believe in free trade. We believe in a transparent system. I think one of the things that we've seen with USMCA is that with the speed that it was decided, there are many unknowns that are now catching up to us, including the whole rapid response system, which I know we're going to talk about a little bit. I do want to talk for a moment and sort of set the stage on tariffs. Our industry believes in an open global system. We have fought for that for years, my entire career at MEMA. But what we have seen on steel and aluminum tariffs and China tariffs is these tariffs are being absorbed by our industry. With very few times, and the aftermarket might be one of them, they may be passed on to consumers. But what this is doing is when our members are buying steel, aluminum, or products that are coming in from China that need further manufacturing. It is increasing the cost of those goods. And when you increase the cost of those goods, there is less money, less ability to pay workers more, to do more worker training, to invest in all of the things that we just heard in the first session that we need to invest in: autonomy, electrification, shared mobility. And this has been an enormous burden on our industry, and one that we are anxious to work with the Biden administration to attack. Which takes me to China, and in 35 seconds, I will not try to attempt to discuss all the things that we have to talk about with China. And I look forward to my conversation with Michael about this, but understand our industry has long opposed China's efforts on counterfeit and long looked forward to a policy that would promote greater transparency in China, fewer counterfeit goods being exported. But tariffs are not the way to get there. Again, this has produced a burden on our own industry. And before I wrap up, just to nudge Kristin a little bit, I must say domestic policy has a lot to do with global trade challenges. We've seen automatic vehicles, electrification, where we lag behind other countries and other economies in these regulations, and this has to change. So Kristin, back to you, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you, Anne. It's great to have you, as always, and we are going to have some great conversations here, I believe. I'm now going to turn it to Michael Dunne. Let's bring us to China for a bit.
Thank you very much, Kristin. So good to be with you all today. As we try to wrap our minds around the U.S. China relationship on trade and across the board, arguably the best person to go to in this regard for a read on the future is Henry Kissinger. I mean, after all, he was there from the very beginning, and even today, he has access to the highest levels of power, both in China and in Washington, D.C. So I took interest in a speech he gave at the end of 2019 when he minced no words in saying the United States and China are in the foothills of a Cold War. Those are pretty strong words from a guy who had been the architect of actually normalizing relationships between the two countries. He updated his read earlier this year at a private gathering in San Francisco, and I listened to him when he said, the United States and China are no longer in the foothills of a Cold War. We've actually moved up to the mountain passes. The trend is not our friend. Things are getting more and more tense and acrimonious between China and the United States. So if we step back and look and say, well, why? What went wrong? I'd like to introduce a Chinese idiom. That idiom is sleeping in the same bed, dreaming different dreams, or in Chinese, 同床异梦. 4 characters that sum up the relationship. On the US or Western side, we've been willing to give access to technology in exchange for access to the China market. We would bring the technology to China, and we would, as a result, get access to the massive Chinese market. On the Chinese side, they said, okay, that's not a perfect deal, but we'll take it. We'll take some technology from you in exchange for giving you an open door to our market. Well, that sentiment on the Chinese side started to change about 5 years ago when President Xi Jinping and his lieutenants crafted what is known as Made in China 2025. It's an ambition to be the global leader in next generation technologies. That's EVs, AVs, robotics, 5G, AI, you name it. China no longer saw a future in which they would need to rely on the West for technology, but they themselves would build the technology. And, oh, by the way, if we're the ones leading in technology, why do we need to give away market access? That new sentiment, of course, triggered a reaction in the Trump administration that continues today, saying, hey, this is not the understanding we had. We were sleeping in the same bed, dreaming different dreams. Each was getting his or her own, but no longer. And as a result of this new tension, we're seeing 2 or 3 important developments for suppliers globally. First and foremost, we're seeing a once in 50 years reordering of global supply chains. From between 2000 and 2020, more or less, everyone just piled into China with tens of billions of dollars in investments to put their footprint in China, to serve both the China market and export from China globally. That's not the case anymore. Yes, much of that will remain in China, but many suppliers are moving quickly to invest in Southeast Asia, India, and even here back in the United States. So think reordering of global supply chains. It'll take 20, 25 years to get there. We're at the front end of that. Second one, inside China, if you're operating inside China as a supplier, 2 trains to be on the lookout for. One train is the electric vehicle train. If you're a supplier to EVs, there's good news. EV sales in China, production in China will be 2.5 million this year, going to 5 million in 2025 to 9 million in 2030. Get on that train if you're not already there. The other train to be on the lookout for, of course, is the regulators, and that's not a friendly train. Just ask Alibaba or Didi. There's no question about it. U.S. suppliers, Western suppliers operating in China are more vulnerable to regulatory crackdowns for any reason at any time than we've seen in the last 30 years. So be wary, be vigilant. Is there any silver lining in all this? Absolutely. We're seeing a trend toward more investment here in the United States in batteries, in chips. TSMC is investing in plants here. Foxconn's coming here. And many new exciting startups in the United States on the battery front. So think reordering of the global supply chains, a diversification away from China, and more investment here in the United States. With that, I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Perfect timing, and thank you, Michael. That really leads us into at least a lot of questions I have, but I'm sure you guys in the audience have some questions as well as folks online. So if you could please submit those through the app, that would be great. Otherwise, you're going to hear what I think, and maybe you care about what I think, but I think you might want to hear some of your questions answered as well. I'm going to pick up where you left off, Michael. At the event that Brad mentioned, Ambassador Tai talked about making trade a force for good that encourages a race to the top. And many of the sessions here at MBS this week are focused on the incredible technology, process, and product changes that are happening in this industry. And these changes are supported by trade policy that impacts raw materials for batteries and technology for automation and machinery and equipment to manufacture the critical inputs such as semiconductors, which Ann mentioned. The economic developers in the room, and I always think about you guys, are battling day in and day out to land some of that investment, and much of it foreign direct investment to preserve and hopefully grow future auto jobs in the community. Can we talk a little bit about what the role trade plays in localizing the production as our industry is turning supply chains upside down and completely remaking the product and the process by which we do business? So what does trade enable? Does it block? What is your role? What is your thinking? And I'll start with you, Ann, since you're here.
Since I'm here. I think, first of all, one of the things that we need to make sure the policymakers understand, which is something that all of you understand, that we are a global industry. And, I've had a couple of disagreements with members of Congress who say, when I talk about slowdowns at the ports, they say, we just need to make everything in the United States. No, we don't need to make everything in the United States. We need to be an active part of the global world. And I think the place where Brad and I would agree is we do need to build jobs in the U.S. We have the great ability to build high-tech jobs. You mentioned batteries. We were big supporters of the Senate action to build more semiconductors here in the U.S. So $52 billion investment, hopefully, if the House passes it. These are activities that need to take place in the U.S. so we can stay competitively globally. But the dream of building everything here, and many of you know this, I'm considered by some people the wire harness lady, but I would walk around Congress, and I see my friends laughing about this, I would walk around Congress with a wire harness in my hand saying, we don't need to make these here, but what we do need to make here are the technologies that are associated with the wire harnesses. And I think that's one of the things that we have to balance out. And the problem that we have with tariffs is that is increasing the cost oftentimes on inputs into these goods and these components. And by increasing those costs, and we've heard this over and over again, you can then, our members, our industry here in the United States is then no longer able to compete with the completed good that might be made someplace else. So this is a very delicate balance that we're moving into, and I think one where we have to find our commonality, but we have to invest in workforce, we have to invest in raw materials, we have to invest in the supply chain, but with the understanding that we're not going to make it all here, but we need to make the most important things here so that we can continue to stay competitive.
Great. And your wire harness example reminds me of, there was a, in the previous administration, Ann and I were talking before, we would often get things, 10 o'clock at night, 11 o'clock, and, and they would be, several things all at once. But one was, we're going to shut down the Mexican border. And well, that will display how completely fragile our supply chains are, because shut down the Mexican border and all production stops in 3 days. Because a vast majority of our wiring harnesses come from our ally and friend, Mexico, just to the south of our border. So, there's a delicate balance, I guess, from where you make the things and where we need the things, and how, not even just trade policy, but health policy, immigration policy, all sorts of other things lay on top of.
Absolutely.
Couldn't disrupt our industry very
Americans
easily.
are not going to pay more for a vehicle for wire harnesses to be made in the U.S. Yeah. But they may pay more for a vehicle that has new ADAS technology in it, that has greater electrification, that has more automation. So there are opportunities here for us to build our workforce. But I just want to reiterate, one of the things that we're seeing is the need for more workforce training and for more workers to come into our factories from the floor of the manufacturing facility all the way up through the supply chain.
So Brad, I'm going to let you jump in here. I think you have some places where you agree with Ann and some that you don't.
Undoubtedly, a lot of agreement there. I would say a few things. Tariffs are a legitimate trade and economic tool. They have been so since the time of Alexander Hamilton. I mentioned in my remarks this idea that, boy, just lowering tariffs and everything's good. Well, lowering tariffs and not doing anything else means that we are subjecting ourselves to competition that isn't based on the same societal and labor standards that we have built up here in the United States very painstakingly and with a lot of sacrifice. I think companies recognize this early on because they were not willing to expand trade until they got investor rights in trade agreements. So trade agreements became mostly about protecting investors' rights to invest abroad under a regime that was contained in the trade agreements, and about lowering tariffs. If you study the tariff situation that the United States is in, our tariffs are a lot lower than everybody else's tariffs. And that makes for a rough go in some cases. So we believe that tariffs are a legitimate trade tool and they should be used to help us achieve our goals. So maybe I'll stop there with, we're not, training is a whole other thing. If you have a union shop, you have a lot of training. We negotiate it and put it in our contracts. If you don't have a union shop, the chances are that the training is not what it could or should be, or that the OEM is coming in and saying, hey, why are you spending so much money on training? We want that in a price down. Michael, do you want to weigh in?
Perhaps let's talk batteries just for a moment. If we pull the lens way back and we're looking down on planet Earth and an alien comes along and says, where do you guys make your batteries? It would quickly become clear that battery manufacturing is concentrated in this tight geographic area called North Asia. Japan, Korea, China combined for 90+% of global manufacturing of batteries. United States, of course, has the Tesla Panasonic joint venture in Nevada, more in the pipeline, but it takes time. Europe's got a couple startups, Northvolt and others, but it's really lopsided in terms of distribution of manufacturing of a key component that will go into electric vehicles for years to come. So what to do about that? We need to have manufacturing more balanced globally, including the United States. In the short term, I can see tariffs as an incentive for foreign direct investment into the United States. Oh, give us some breathing room so we can ramp up. And then eventually, as we're more competitive, tariffs can come down. But right now, if we say no tariffs and continue to import from Asia and from China in particular, China is now the largest. 75% of mega factories, battery factories globally, are now situated in China. China would just roll across the world with its battery exports and control a key strategic industry for the future. That's not okay, especially given current political tensions. So there needs to be some mechanism to incentivize investment in batteries right here in North America.
Yeah, and Michael, I couldn't agree more. We have to have those investments, and we have to have those investments not just in batteries, but in other operations. I want to be clear, it's not that our position is that tariffs overall are never a tool that needs to be used. But what's the problem is when tariffs are used as a unilateral tool, and you treat all inputs the same. And that's where, for instance, tariffs on steel and aluminum coming from one of our biggest trading partners, the EU. I'm not sure what that has done except increase the cost of many of our members' ability to get steel and aluminum overall. So I'm sure this could be another conversation for probably a 2-day dialogue. And I know Kristin's got other things, but I just wanted to clarify that one piece.
I think Michael's hit on something here, which is that batteries are a good way to talk about the things that we need to do. The flip side of trade policy is industrial policy. And for so many years, the United States has not done a very good job of really setting up our companies and our facilities to be successful in a way that China has. Yet we lead the world in battery research, certainly among the leaders. We could capture future generations here with the right domestic policies. Maybe, as Michael says, tariffs are a little way to, get the ball rolling. But the truth is that we need to have a market, we need to have a technology policy, and we need to be making it attractive, things like investment tax credits and so on. So the future of battery technology is a little bit up in the air, as probably Michael knows better than anybody here. The chemistry even isn't settled. Solid state could be down the road in 5 or 10 years. So there's a lot of opportunity if we can get our combination of trade and industrial policies right. And we haven't done a very good job on the industrial policy side.
Yeah, and I think Brad, you're right, because you look at what's going on with semiconductors right now, and it's the same thing. We can't depend solely on the importation of semiconductors or batteries to allow us to continue to evolve our industry and transform our industry.
Well, and I think this is, extremely important in the topic of industrial policy and what we're going to do about these new technology changes. I believe the panel that follows this one with John Bozzella will pick up on many of these topics and what the industry is doing, what the policy is coming from Washington. So if you're looking for picking up this conversation a little bit further, I would suggest that you attend that session as well. We do have a question that I think picks up on the tariff issue, though, that any one of you can weigh in on. Is there any hint what the Biden administration might do about the Trump tariffs? Are we leaving them in place? Are they leverage for other negotiations? So what do we think? I mean, we all learned all kinds of numbers in the code about 301 and 238 and 125 and 232, and we learned all sorts of numbers. So are we going to learn more numbers? Are we going to pull some of these off in exchange for some concessions? And I know that the trade ambassador and the Secretary of State have been making the rounds of our friendly allies to kind of get them in order. So we still have tariffs on many of those countries.
Yeah, I think there seems to be some real movement on the steel and aluminum tariffs from the EU, and there seems to be some indication that they may remove those tariffs, at the end of this year. So they're talking November, December kind of time frame. I have never thought, and those of you who've asked me this question, I don't see the Biden administration removing tariffs on Chinese goods anytime real soon. Our focus has been on reopening the exclusion process. So many of you enjoyed, you asked, you requested exclusions from certain products and you were able to get those exclusions. We think that's something that needs to be reopened. The trade ambassador and others have indicated that that's something they're interested in doing. But I think, we're in for a long discussion. I think, what Michael said about our Chinese, our relationship with China would indicate that it's not going to be anytime soon that those tariffs on Chinese goods are removed. But I really think where we've got to take a look at is the exclusion process, so that we take a look at what we need to have tariffs on and where we need to have exclusions on them.
Great. I think I'm going to go to another audience question here, which is about similar. What is most of our trade policy is based on trade in goods, but increasingly services are taking up more of the production in auto. Services are very much global, and hard goods can be more regional. How are we going to address the fact that services are impervious to the USMCA, according to this questioner, and other trade agreements? How can you regulate the global character of services in the supply chain? And the questioner has in mind particularly China. So I'm going to start with you, Michael.
Oh, that's a good question. In particular, at a time when China is ratcheting up its surveillance and investigations into anything related to software and data. The headlines just last month with Didi going public and then getting hammered by the regulatory agencies CAC and SAMR for not having adequate data security. So if they're doing that kind of hands-on investigation of their own leading tech companies, imagine what U.S. companies stepping in or Western companies stepping into the China market will need to prepare for, not just on the day they step into the market, but every day they operate there. So with regards to trade, yes, probably we can get Chinese market access, but once you're in the market, will you have free reign to operate as you do in other countries? Probably not. Earlier this year, Tesla had a dust up with the same two agencies because there were concerns and worries about data collection through the autopilot system. So we're in a new era of trade in services and data. And by the same sort of logic that there's been this bifurcation, between the United States and China in terms of national interest, I see the same thing playing out with regards to software and data. You'll have a China plus kingdom, and you'll have a United States Western plus kingdom. And I don't see that those two are merging. In fact, they're moving apart.
Do you want to weigh in on services, Ann?
No, I think the whole idea of cybersecurity and where we're going with this is going to be key to everything. You've seen this administration really sort of, focus in on it too. So to assume that the China market is going to change, it's been one of the focuses. So I think Michael said it really well.
Great. This is another really great question from our audience. Thank you, guys. The administration pushed USMCA, yet the auto industry still expects Chinese pricing. Will we see this embraced at some point? I think that what they're looking at is, is there going to be some pricing pressure upward because they're realizing we can't get everything at China price if we're going to do it domestically sourced, as you mentioned earlier?
I think this is going to be one of the challenges of USMCA. So as we know, the North American content will go up. There is also in the OE industry the labor value content, which is going to change operations for many of you as OE suppliers, because even though it's a vehicle-specific requirement, it does affect many of you as suppliers also. So I think there's those pieces of it. I do think the other part of it is how do we balance this out? So as we know, the average cost of a vehicle is around $40,000. How do we do this in a way so that new vehicles are continuing to be affordable for Americans, even with new technologies, whether it's safety technologies or emissions technologies and everything like that? And I think that's what the tier ones and many of the vehicle manufacturers are trying to balance out at the same time. I think what concerns me is if we don't, and I know Kristin said we're going to talk about domestic policy in another panel, but if we don't embrace and find our own market for it here, and I think both Brad and Michael mentioned this too, and find our own market for new automation, new safety, new emissions technologies, and we don't find that, are we going to end up with completed vehicles that are being brought into this market that are going to compete with vehicles that are made in North America? And that would be a real tragedy for our entire supply base. And that would be a real tragedy for the workers that all of you employ every day.
Brad, do you want to weigh in?
You know, I'm old enough to have been around back when Dr. Deming was advising General Motors and Gypsy Rose Lee was running those, and Lloyd Rice was running those, or were running the Deming user seminars. And from my point of view, and having worked at a GM assembly plant at the start of my career, Willow Run Assembly, for those old enough to remember that mess, you know, the supplier functions are driving suboptimal decision-making and suboptimal outcomes inside of larger corporations. And the continual price beatdowns, the China price, we got the China price through a lot of things. Michael was, I think, somewhat generous in describing the nature of the tech transfer that happened between China and Western corporations. I'm not sure companies came with their technology, were asked to come with their technology, perhaps. You know, the continual issues with currency, misalignment, not necessarily manipulation, at times manipulation, but misalignment, the labor issues, you know, the subsidies that are well known around electricity and land and taxes and so on. That's what drove the China price. And the worker-centered trade model that we favor is a way of saying, hey, all these ancillary policies that drive work to low labor standard countries that actually push companies to have low labor standards have to be upgraded. We're in an era when the victories that we had in this country over the past 60 or 70 years to raise standards, to create the middle class, now need to be taken global. And that's the answer to escaping the China price. Although I will tell you, it feels like a bank, feels like some trick shot kind of thing to do that. But that's about where I think we're at.
I think we've got a great question here too. The questioner is asking, what is the latest on the Biden supply chain strike force? Now, of course, there were 100-day reports on supply chain, as well as a simultaneous report from the battery investigation from the Department of Energy. Will these reports have meaningful impact on nearshoring or onshoring of commodities other than EV batteries, EV battery minerals, and microchips? If so, what other commodities could benefit from the supply chain reports?
So there was two parts to the president's executive order. There was the 100-day report, which the questioner laid out, which dealt with semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, critical minerals, and batteries. So there's those four efforts that the administration really looked at. There is a longer set of initiatives, which is a year-long initiative, which includes the entire transportation sector, which we are hopeful will deal with some of the things that the questioner was talking about, of not just looking at the sort of immediate crisis overall of semiconductors and sort of the immediate issue of batteries and critical minerals. I think one of the things that's sort of interesting to look at and problematic is if you look at semiconductors, we both have a current crisis. At the same time, we have a longer term need. And so the question is, can we deal with that current crisis, and what is the role of the government to help us figure that out? And that's something that we are working on a day-to-day basis with auto manufacturers, with chip manufacturers, and other suppliers. That longer term need really needs that investment that I think both Michael and Brad were talking about in the United States, so we can start to have some of our own supply here. But I would say that, you know, we've got to pay attention to both of these efforts. This president has demonstrated, just like the last president did, his willingness to use the power of the pen and use the power of being president to establish these executive orders that will direct his agencies to do things. I think we're going to see a lot more of that and more regulatory activity, from here on out. So there's both of those we have to pay attention to, in both the short-term and the longer-term issues.
Brad, do you want to jump in?
I would say that the one-year report is going to be pretty expansive. It seems to me that they did a great job with the 100-day report, and really, on the critical minerals, for example, we've got to step up. I think there is a lot of naive attitudes around what it takes to start up a battery factory. It's a long process. Just the anode and cathode, as Michael mentioned, Korea, it's dominating in some of that stuff. Just to get that stood up is a couple of years. When a battery factory starts, if you have a 30% rejection rate your first year, you're doing great. And so this idea that the capacity is just going to jump up as soon as we find the minerals is tough. The chips issue, the legacy chips issue, half of the globe's installed capacity is legacy chips. So I think there's a little bit of a kind of a market issue, and I don't think, maybe it's not worth parsing here. I don't know enough to parse who put their orders in a proper magnitude and who didn't. Some companies are having a rougher time than others, but when GM decides to stand down pickup truck production, it's really serious, because as we all know, trucks equals bucks.
Yeah, I think there is a lot to be done in this next year over those supply chain reports, and an expansion is probably in order, or that they're probably going to think about. These are the critical ones that we're starting with: batteries, minerals, and pharmaceuticals, the top line. But I could imagine seeing this going to other commodities as well. This isn't. Go ahead,
Kristin. Yes, if I had the opportunity to be a U.S. trade representative for a moment, for a day, and I was looking at China, I would first of all assess, where is our leverage? Where is our leverage? Because that's exactly what the Chinese do very well. Where is their leverage? So where is our leverage vis-a-vis China the next 5 to 10 years? If we look at their car market in particular, sales and production have been declining for the last 3-4 years, and there's no indication of a bounce in the immediate future. We probably have seen peak car demand in China. Yes, electric vehicles on the ascendancy, but ICE are falling off. Bottom line, Chinese manufacturers across the board need global markets to sustain their growth and their prosperity, including the United States. So if I am talking to China, I'd say, we'd welcome your products here in the United States, provided that they're manufactured here. And that's exactly the kind of thing that Chery and Ha Automotive recently ran up against. They were all set to import Chery SUVs into the US, price them using a China price, buy market share, do the traditional China thing. But they found out, these tariff rates and these local content requirements are out of sight. We can't get there and make any money. In fact, we'll lose too much money. So the only alternative is to build a transplant in the United States to make it work. And we've already seen Volvo commit to that in South Carolina. They'll build future electric Volvos and Polestars there. I would really, if I'm a trade representative, say, China, let's balance this thing out. You can't export from home forever. You need to put money into North America.
Well, and that's a pathway that was followed by the Japanese, the Koreans, the Germans, all the other automakers that have located production here. I know that there's a number of deals out there right now that our economic developers are looking at for the similar localization, and a lot of Chinese companies are thinking about, can I bring a knockdown kit plant? What level of localization is going to be required to enter this market? And one of the first vehicles out in the parking lot here is a Buick Envision, a Chinese-built vehicle. So they're already here in some forms, the Volvos, the Buicks, Yeah, it's a conversation that's actively going on. But one of the points, another question from the audience, and I think it's an important one, current workforce shortages in the States, and how do those affect the company's abilities to look to the U.S. for future growth? And does that mean shifting opportunities to other regions or other regions within North America, other regions in the world other than China?
So I think this might be a place where Brad and I disagree, but that's okay. We're both from Washington, so we know how to disagree.
He's from Detroit.
He's from Detroit, okay. So, if you brought a group of suppliers into a room, the number one issue that they're having is workforce. And there's a lot of reasons for it. It's been a systemic issue for a number of years of workforce training and upskilling. But there's also the whole issue of, the whole semiconductor shortage and other issues. And when you bring people out from, it affects suppliers and you lay people off and do they come back? And there's there's a lot of different reasons we are where we are right now. But I cannot say strongly enough to states, economic development people, and to people in Washington, D.C., we have to invest in these workforces. We have to invest in the needs right now. But we also have to invest in the needs for the future. And that includes the whole issue of automation, electrification, what that looks like. And it has to do with, upskilling those people, being able to train them for new jobs, being able to make sure that they have a job in the future. We just heard a whole speech about, bringing people in and making people feel like they're part of a, growing industry. You want to make sure that there's a future there too. And this is not just an issue that suppliers can deal with their OEM customers. It's going to take investment from industry. It's going to take investment from local governments, state governments, and the federal government. But it's also going to have to do a vision for the future of what skills we need and what skills we need for right now as far as what skills we need for the future. Are we going to lose people because of it? If you can't find the right workforce to be able to make a component, it's the same thing as not being able to have a market for it. You're going to find other places to have to make it because we are a global industry. And it's not a position that any of us want to be in this country.
Brad?
Pay is too low in the supplier sector. That's a big reason that companies can't attract the workforces they need. There's been a spate of articles recently about the pizza place that couldn't find people till they raised their wage to $15 an hour. Then they had 3,000 applicants. If we had a fight for 15 in manufacturing, something like 1/4 or 30% of production workers would get a raise. It goes back to the pricing issue and the sub-optimization through the supplier function. We can't have low prices premised on low wages and low compensation. And with respect to skills, there are some skill changes. I do a fair amount of work in that area. And I say that Kristin and Ann are both right. I'm from Detroit, but my office is in DC, and Ann and I occasionally run across each other, at least in pre-pandemic times. The workforce system needs investment. This is another area where the U.S. is systemically underinvesting in its economy. We certainly need to do a lot of training. The idea of a skills gap in manufacturing, is maybe in the last 6 months or so, there has been that issue. Historically, going back to 2001, when the DOL started collecting job overturn data, the JOLTS data, manufacturing opening rate has been below the U.S. private sector average every month since 2001. So manufacturers are no better or no worse off than any other sector in the U.S. But it is absolutely the case that we need to invest more in training. We prefer high quality registered apprenticeships as the model for that.
I think I'm going to, we've just got a few minutes left in this session. I want to shift us to USMCA to wrap up. It's obviously the most impactful agreement for the North American producers that are many of who are here in this room. We just celebrated the 1-year anniversary in July. There was a trilateral meeting in Mexico. All three of our trade ministers from all three countries were women for the first time. That was really cool to see. But after 1 year in force, I want to kind of look at what's changed what parts of the deals still need to be refined. And I'm going to start with you, Brad, and start with the labor enforcement actions that you talked about being strongly imposed in this new agreement and being part of the main body of the agreement. We have a enforcement action against Tridonex and Matamoros, by the USTR against GM and Silao. And of course, Mexico has come back at us against tomato growers. So do you want to talk a little bit about the labor actions?
Well, I would say that the labor movement has been thrilled with Ambassador Tai and the Biden administration's application of the USMCA labor provisions. A big part of what happened during the negotiation of USMCA is that Mexico was asked to and agreed to change its labor laws to pull them forward. There were some changes to the Constitution. And it's, I think, pretty well documented that the labor unions in Mexico have not been as democratic as they could be. There are some good unions in the auto sector in Mexico, and there are some bad unions in the auto sector in Mexico. A lot of that, frankly, has been driven by the employers' engagement in the labor system in Mexico, particularly along the border through the employer associations. But people are surprised when they find out that U.S. labor's number one demand for USMCA was labor rights for Mexico. That is because we are linked in the same labor market as auto workers or manufacturing workers in Mexico. And as long as they are suppressed, as long as they are working for $3 or $4 an hour, that's pressure on us. It's pressure on our local, our mom and pop, the locally owned suppliers in the second and third tier. And raising wages and creating a consumer market in Mexico is a big part of how we see USMCA succeeding.
Great. Anne, what still remains? What's still on the table for USMCA that we've got to clear up?
Well, I mean, let's be clear. What Brad is referring to, those of you who haven't paid attention to it, is the labor rapid response system, of which indeed 2 cases have been brought, one against GM and one against a motor vehicle supplier. And it's something that you must pay attention to. I think a lot of people think, no, it's the same thing as labor value content. It's not. So, it is a different element of the USMCA. And I think it's also important to recognize it's one that Catherine Tai, the head of USTR, as well as the Biden administration, are very much embraced. And I think we will see it in other trade agreements, particularly with any other trade agreement where we have a developing country where there seems to be a concern about wages back and forth. I do think that, we supported USMCA as MEMA in a large part because we believe in the vibrancy and the need of a North American supply chain. We think it's done well for Canada, for the United States, for Mexico. We think the improvements in modernization of it could be made. It was done quickly. I know in the real world it doesn't seem quickly, but for trade agreement it was quick. There are a lot of things that are now catching up to it, including new rules of origin, other issues associated with it that we are still working our way through. So whether this is going to be a complete success for the industry is, I think, a case that we're going to have to continue to make day in and day out. But our bottom line is we need a strong North American supply chain, and that would benefit all 3 of the countries in North America.
Great. Well, we're down with just a couple of minutes left. I want to thank our speakers very much. Thank you to Anne, to Michael, nice to see you, and Brad. Our main points here, we really have a new administration that's striking a new tone with very similar goals to the previous administration. We've got supply chain disruptions that are likely to be with us for a while, especially as we change the product and the process that we're making. USMCA is pretty much still a work in progress. There's a lot to get over here. And Michael, I think you would agree, buckle up on China.
Buckle up on China. And you know what, Kristin, when I first got to China so many years ago, China wasn't a colossal manufacturing powerhouse with all kinds of supply chains. In fact, it was a manufacturing weakling. That wasn't that long ago. There's 20 or 25 years ago. There's no reason, let's use our imagination. There's no reason we cannot envision and reshape things such in a manner that right here in North America, we build great things too and have our own strong supply chains. We can do this.
I don't think you have any disagreement. Brad's nodding his head, Ann's nodding her head. We all are, and I think the audience agrees as well. So thank you guys for such a great panel, and thank you for joining us in person and virtual here at MBS. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.